Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Hunt, and I'm your host for Emptying the Closet, the Personal and Political of Coming Out. When I'm not hosting a CAN TV program, I'm the executive director of Pride Action Tank, a multi-issue project incubator and think tank on LGBTQ issues focused on action that leads to improved outcomes and opportunities. We're a project of the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, where I also serve as the senior director of policy and advocacy. And in my spare time, I'm also the co-host of OUTspoken LGBTQ Storytelling, which takes place the first Tuesday each month at Sidetrack, the video bar located in the Lakeview neighborhood. This program will be airing on National Coming Out Day, October 11th. National Coming Out Day was created in 1988 in recognition of the importance of both personal and political coming out. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, which is considered to be a major marker of the beginning of the move towards civil and social rights for the LGBTQ+ community in Chicago. After Stonewall, coming out became personal, and in some cases, a political statement of identity and power. This program will provide a glimpse into what coming out and being out means to individuals and communities, not just in Chicago, but across the globe. We're going to start with some storytelling. We have two storytellers who have told stories at OUTspoken, and one of them you've already met. That's me. So I'm going to start with my story. I drove from my place at 5500 South Chicago at Hamilton Avenue to Mary's place at 7200 North Hamilton Avenue for our third date. At the time, my daughters were young, so I had to cook every day. When Mary offered to cook dinner for me while they were at their dad's place, I gladly accepted. She greeted me at the door with a kiss and welcomed me inside. Her place was so quiet and orderly compared to mine. In my house, the chaos of hyper-scheduled lives showed itself in the piles of unread mail, toys wedged between sofa cushions, and last night's dinner dishes still in the sink. Mary's place screamed order, with its trays for mail, hooks for keys, and shiny, obstruction-free wooden floors. Nearly finished newspapers and magazines were stacked neatly on her coffee table, like in photographs in Architectural Digest. We went into the kitchen, where she handed me a glass of red wine and asked what I could do to help. Wow, her kitchen was so clean. She asked me to help with the salad while the water boiled for the pasta. As we sipped wine, the sound of chopping and peeling and shredding vegetables was the backbeat to our conversation about the work and life events that occurred in the week since we'd last seen each other. Mary added pasta to the boiling water and poured us each another glass of wine as we kept talking. I really liked the fact that somehow Mary drew me out in ways that I only noticed when I looked back on our time together. But what I noticed in this moment was that Mary and I had completely different cooking styles. She must be one of those people who can cook only one thing at a time, I thought. I would have started making the pasta sauce before the water boiled, so everything would be done at the same time. But no garlic or onions were sauteing, no meat was browning, no sauce was simmering. I watched her drain the pasta, then open a cabinet door from which she took out a jar of Prego pasta sauce. To my amazement, she poured the sauce right from the jar onto the pasta. You aren't going to add anything to that? It was more of an accusation than a question. What would I add? She asked. Seasoning, I nearly shouted. Mary is white. As an interracial couple, I knew we'd have some cultural differences to work through, so I understood that I wouldn't be getting my mother's spaghetti when Mary invited me over for dinner, but damn! Where are your spices, I asked. She pointed to a cabinet over the stove. Salt, pepper, chili powder, and garlic powder. Not much to work with, but I had a full-time job and 2 kids. I knew how to make a meal out of thin air. I sprinkled the garlic powder on the salad, added the dressing, and mixed it all in a bowl. Employing my mother's technique of a dash of this and a dash of that, I worked on that sauce until it had some flavor. And then we sat down to dinner. I saw a change wash over her as she ate a forkful of salad. "Oh my God, this salad is so good," she said. "How did you do this?" Then she tried the pasta. "This is delicious," she said with her mouth full. "I never thought about seasoning the sauce before." Now I appreciate a woman who loves food. As Mary ate and ate, I made 2 decisions. One was that this was the woman I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and 2, I would be the primary cook in this relationship. Within a few months, Mary joined the girls and me on a visit to my family in Kansas City, Missouri for Christmas. We were a few days early, but my mother already had started cooking the holiday dinner, and she still managed to have a whole separate meal waiting for us when we arrived. Cooking was love to my mother. She'd made one of my favorite meals: spaghetti, tossed salad, and toasted garlic bread. When I think about my mother, I often think about her spaghetti. Because she didn't measure anything, passing down the recipe was difficult, but I know what went in the sauce. Ground hamburger meat, smoked sausage, sauteed onions, garlic, and bell peppers, 1 jar each of Prego and Ragu pasta sauce with meat, chili powder, barbecue seasoning, salt, pepper, paprika, and a little sugar. That's way different from pasta with sauce right from the jar. As I loaded my plate, I suddenly remembered that Mary was a vegetarian. I had forgotten to pass that information on to my mother, but it didn't matter. Mary was already sitting at the table eating spaghetti like it was her last meal, and she hasn't been a vegetarian since. Mary and I moved in together after dating for a year, which is a really long time for lesbians. Over time, we fell into a rhythm around household chores. She did a lot of the cleaning and took care of the car and the pets. I did most of the cooking, some of the cleaning, and all of the grocery shopping. When my daughters were with us, Mary and I shared the task of getting them to school, dance and swimming classes, medical appointments, and their social events. During trips to Kansas City, Mary would hang out in the kitchen with my mother, washing the dishes, serving as her sous chef, and just watching my mother work her magic. After my mother died nearly 10 years into our relationship, Mary would try her hand at making some of the dishes we'd enjoyed so much at my mother's table. She'd surprise me by making greens or peach cobbler, even my mother's spaghetti. Initially, I was focused on what was missing. The flavor was off, the texture wasn't right. She'd drain all the grease from the meat. Grease is a critical ingredient for traditional soul food. I was even angry that it was Mary who was trying to replicate my mother's cooking and not me. But at some point, I gave in to Mary's culinary gestures. Around the time my oldest daughter went to college, Mary began taking cooking classes. She started with a knife sharpening class. Later, she took classes for making appetizers and meats and root vegetables and more. My youngest daughter and I would devour the samples Mary brought from each session, and we were willing guinea pigs when she practiced at home. After a few classes, Mary let me know that students could bring a guest to one of the classes in the series. And I knew she was subtly inviting me to come with her, but I resisted. I already knew how to cook. Plus, I learned from one of the best, my mother. But eventually, I stopped being a jerk about it and went with her. The class was in an industrial kitchen in the Loop. Some of her classmates brought companions who actually looked happy to be there. I, on the other hand, was feeling a little cocky. After all, people liked my cooking. I didn't need any help. I put my ego in check after we were split into groups and started working on our assignments. My group was making a pasta dish. This is where I learned that you aren't supposed to put oil in the pasta water to keep the noodles from sticking. And I learned to cook a vegetable I never heard of called Kobe Rob. I actually had a ball. As her confidence grew, Mary started making appetizers for our dinner parties, then dinner a few nights a week, and the occasional Sunday breakfast. Eventually, she was doing almost all the cooking. The transition was jarring at first. As my mother's daughter, cooking had become my thing and was critical to my identity. But I had to admit, it was a blessing that Mary was cooking so much, and because I had a very demanding job that included attending meetings and events on the evenings and often on weekends, and we won't even discuss Pride Month. I became like my kids when they were younger, asking, "What's for dinner?" when I got home. By the time the youngest daughter was finishing high school, Mary was doing all the grocery shopping and growing herbs on the kitchen windowsill. Our kitchen cabinet was full of seasonings like saffron and Himalayan pink salt and whole nutmeg. And then there were the dry rubs and sauces Mary would concoct for fish and chicken. We had food I never ate as a child, like kale, roasted beets, feta cheese. Mary spoiled me. A few years ago, she started working for FEMA and was deployed to Durham, North Carolina from mid-May to late September. After 18 years of seeing each other every day, we were going to be a long-distance couple. Because Mary always worries that I won't have anything to eat when she's gone a few days, she went into overdrive when she found out she'd be gone a few months. "What do you think you want to eat while I'm away?" she asked a few days before her deployment. Now, this was a hard question for me. Other than for special occasions, I hadn't had to plan a meal in years. "I don't know, babe. Easy stuff," I answered. She went to the store while I went to yet another event. And when I got back, she gave me a tour of all the things she'd purchased, as if I wouldn't be able to find them on my own. The day before she left, she made a big pan of lasagna. She sectioned off half of it into meal-sized portions that she froze in individual containers so I'd have quick meals when I needed them. And because I don't have much of a work-life balance, it took months for me to get through all of the lasagna. One night at dinner time, I opened the refrigerator and saw a jar of olives, a carton of soy milk, orange juice, condiment packets from takeout, and something I no longer recognized. So I made a meal out of thin air. When the pot of water was boiling, I poured in the pasta. When it was done, I drained it, poured on a little pasta sauce from the jar, and sat down to dinner. Thank you. Okay. Our next storyteller is Archy Jamjun. Archy is a storyteller and writer. He is a two-time Grand Slam champion of the Moth in Chicago. He is also curator of OUTspoken and was a featured storyteller at the National Storytelling Summit this past July. He has an MFA in creative writing from Roosevelt University. Let's welcome Archy to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I opened the bathroom cabinet, and my sister's beauty supply stood before me. "We'll make you pretty," they seemed to say. "My cooling sensation works wonders," said the jar of Noxzema cold cream. "I will tighten your pores," said the St. Ives cucumber face mask. And then the bottle of sun and hair lightener threw down the gauntlet. "I will give you white people hair." I was 11 years old and constantly locking myself in the bathroom for the wrong reason. I just wanted to be pretty. Now, my parents' friends always said that I was handsome and my sister Annie was pretty, but as their eyes moved quickly from me to linger on her, the truth became translucent. On this highway called life, Annie could stop traffic. I would get run over. Annie's beauty allowed her to attend Barbizon, a modeling school in downtown Chicago, attended by a dozen rich white girls, 2 of which had new noses, and 1 that had come from Texas and never appeared without fringe. On Saturday afternoons, they would practice essential life lessons like how to walk down a runway and take off a jacket at the same time. Now, Annie excelled, but as I watched the other girls, I just kind of got really angry. See, I had seen George Michael's music video for Freedom, which featured real supermodels walking down a real runway, and I had practice in our basement, and I knew I could outwalk all those girls. But even at our Thai temple, my sister was the star. When our temple put on a production of Manora, the Thai story of creation, they cast Annie as a lead angel. I had to play a monkey. After the performance on the drive home, my parents told my sister what a great job she had done. They were so proud of her. And I, like a glum troll, sank deep into the beige leather interior of our Cadillac. I scowled at the moon and stars for placing me in her shadow. My mother looked back at me and said, "Archie, why do you look so sad?" "Oh, that's Archie," my dad started. "He see the moon and the star and he think about science, just like his dad." These people did not know me. They just saw their young Asian son and figured I would be good at things like math and science. The academic roadmaps for ugly people. Yes, I said it, ugly people. I would not be pushed down that road. I would be pretty, and I had a plan. Step 1, take my sister's Noxzema and rub it all over my face until its camphor, eucalyptus, and menthol made it feel like a cough drop. Step 2, slowly apply the St. Ives cucumber face mask and take it off evenly so it came off in one sheath instead of dozens of flakes. Step 3, apply the sun and hair lightener, because in the 90s, nothing made an Asian person look cooler than orange hair. Step 4, imagine Keanu Reeves. In 1991, Keanu Reeves starred in the mega hit blockbuster music video Rush Rush by Paula Abdul. It was a remake of the classic film Rebel Without a Cause, and I often imagined that I was Paula and Keanu was my rebel. But one day, while I was engaged in my beauty routine, a more specific vision came to mind. Keanu would pull up to the front of my parents' house with a screech of 2 wheels because that rebel had discovered his cause, me, Archy Jamjun. As I ran out to meet him, my dad would beg me to stay. "Oh, Archie, I was so wrong. You are so much more beautiful and talented than your sister. I will not make you study chemistry anymore. Please stay." Enticing, but it was too late. I would hop into the sidecar attached to Keanu's motorcycle, and we would speed up I-94 to a romantic and exotic land called Wisconsin. As the wind blew through my bowl cut, I would look up at my rebel and say, "Have you ever been in love before?" And then he would say, "No, I have not been in love before. Have you been in love before?" "No, I've never been in love. I've never experienced love. Isn't that terrible?" And with those words, Keanu would pull over to the side of the highway. He would get off the bike with one swing of his meaty hind quarter and walk up to me. "Terrible, Archie? It's not terrible. It just reminds you that we're all alone." But with those words, an epiphany broke out into his face as he realized that we were not alone anymore. We had each other. I closed my eyes and puckered my lips. I got ready for my first kiss. The bathroom door swung open. It was Annie. "Are you using my beauty products again? How many times do I have to tell you? These things are for girls." I grabbed the jar of Noxzema. It does not say for girls anywhere on this jar. "It doesn't have to. What is wrong with you? Do you want to use my maxi pads next?" "This is my bathroom too. I will use whatever I want." And I pushed past her. In those days, however, my sister was so much stronger. She grabbed me by my t-shirt and flung me into the wall. She drew back her hand and clawed 3 marks onto the side of my face. Like Nancy Kerrigan after the attack on her knee, I fell to the ground screaming, "Why? Why? Not only would these marks forestall my plans for beauty, I would have to explain them to the kids at school, where rumor had it I could be gay. And that's when I decided I'd had enough. Now, I didn't usually engage in boy activities, but I had been playing a certain video game, Street Fighter II. And I had become very adept at a certain character, the mistress of the tornado kicks, Chun-Li. With the video game as inspiration, I rose to my feet and imagined Annie and I in a dirty alley in China. To her utter confusement, I started bouncing around on my 2 feet. And then I pulled back my leg and kicked her in the stomach with a loud "Yah!" She ran to the toilet seat and threw up. I had won, or so I thought. After wiping her mouth, my she-beast of a sister did rise from the laboratory and pinned me to the ground. As she was berating me, I could tell she'd had dried fish for breakfast. Just as she was about to claw 3 marks onto the other side of my face, my mother intervened and saved me. And the next day she took me to Walgreens, where she bought me my own Noxzema, my own face mask, and my own Channyn. Why? Because my mother hates uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes it's just easier to go to Walgreens. But coming out for me wasn't a large burst through a door. It was more like slowly opening the door. And on that day, I knew, even if my mother didn't know, and even if I didn't know, that it was gonna be safe when I finally did come through the closet. And also on that day, I learned the price of beauty, that it could sometimes be bloody. Not because beauty in the end is worth very much, but if you're gonna choose to be bad at math and science, you better be cute. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Archie, for that amazing story, and to Outspoken for supplying storytellers. You can hear many stories of people coming out and being out and everything in between at Outspoken the first Tuesday of the month at Sidetrack. And so now we're going to switch gears, and you don't have to be as entertaining as Archie, so I want you to pressure there. So now we're going to switch gears and talk in more detail about coming out and living out, and this notion of outness and its influence on the personal, the public, and the political. So I am really excited about the conversation that we're going to start with these panelists with us today. They are all equally stellar, so I'm just going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First is Tracy Baim. Wave, Tracy. Tracy is the publisher of the Chicago Reader newspaper. She is owner and co-founder of Windy City Times, a 34-year-old LGBTQ newspaper. She is the author or co-author of 12 books on LGBTQ history, producer of 4 films, creator of the That's So Gay LGBTQ trivia game, producer of 4 films, and a longtime journalist and organizer. Major events she has helped lead include Gay Games 7 in Chicago in 2006, and the March on Springfield for Marriage Equality. She founded the LGBT Chamber of Commerce in 1996 and has won numerous awards for her journalism and activism, including the Studs Terkel Award and Lifetime Achievement Awards from local and national journalism groups. Let's welcome Tracy. A pioneer in the field of LGBTQ studies and the history of sexuality, and a historian of post-war World War II social justice movements, John D'Amelio has written or edited almost a dozen books, including Sexual Politics, Sexual Communities, The Making of Homosexual Minority in the United States, Intimate Matters, A History of Sexuality in America, and Lost Poet, The Life and Times of Bayard Rustin. D'Amelio was a finalist for the National Book Award and received the Brudner's Prize from Yale University for lifetime contributions to LGBT studies. A former co-chair of the Board of Directors of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, he was also the founding director of its Policy Institute. Intimate Matters was quoted by Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy in the 2003 Lawrence v. Texas case, which declared state sodomy statutes unconstitutional. From 1999 to 2014, D'Amelio was professor of gender and women's studies at the University and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is currently president of the board of Gerber Library and Archives, the Chicago's community-based LGBT Historical Society. Let's welcome John. Okay, now I practiced the words in this next bio, but my lazy Midwestern tongue may trip up, so we're going to do this. So after 35 years of activism and community work, Elizabeth Kerekere, best known for her work, Tapu and rainbow communities, treaty advocacy, and youth development. She is a specialist in strategic planning, policy development, and project management. Kerekere is also an artist, having her work exhibited internationally. She is founder and chair, here's a good one, of Tea Funna Funna. Tea Funna Funna, I got it. Let's see, she sits on the board of Rainbow Archives, the Intersex Roundtable Working Group, and the Human Rights Commission. She mentors LGBTIQ leaders and is co-chair of ARA. See, you didn't tell me this one.
Arataiohi.
Arataiohi. I'm getting a little help. Bicultural advisor at
Oh, just go straight to that.
Okay. Things, and Elizabeth is going to fill in some blanks. The National Network Ending Violence, Rainbow Violence, and It's Not Okay campaign, and is Assistant Research Fellow for the LGBTIQ Homeless Project. And in 2017, Elizabeth ran as a Green Party candidate in the general election in New Zealand. Yeah, Elizabeth. And last but certainly not least is Channyn Lynne Parker. Channyn is a transgender advocate, public speaker, community-centric leader, and manager of external relations for Howard Brown Health Center. Prior to this role, Channyn served as manager at the Broadway Youth Center's Youth Development Program and manager of Chicago House Social Service Agency's Trans Life Project. Channyn is the first openly transgender woman to work in the Cook County Department of Corrections, working with populations in protective custody. Among her many awards include the inaugural Trans 100 award. She was a White House speaker. She has won an award. She's spoken at the Chicago Women's March. She's been the recipient of the Henrietta Lacks Award and Equality Illinois' prestigious Freedom Award. Let's welcome Channyn. So a very distinguished panel, as you can see. So I have at least one question for each of you, but feel free to be conversational and talk to each other. Don't just talk to me. And ask questions of each other if you'd like. So just to begin, and we'll just go down the line for each of you, please take a moment to tell us a bit more about your work and your coming out story. You want to start with you, Elizabeth?
Kia ora. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I hail from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Māori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand. This is real, it did hurt. This is part of my culture, and particularly about our strength and power as women, and how that rolls into, I had the purple got added to it because that's just about me as part of the rainbow community. I was a child, a youth activist. So from about the age of 15, I got involved in community work and have been an activist ever since. So coming up nearly 40 years. And so I now mentor about 30 LGBTIQ youth leaders around the country. And that is a joy for me. It keeps me current and it makes sure that my work links into everything that's happening in our community. Mm-hmm. Our organisation, Te Whanawhana, I founded nearly 20 years ago for Māori. Tagatāpui means Māori, it's a traditional term, it means Māori who, with diverse genders, sexualities and sex characteristics. And we were established so we could tell our stories. So I love your storytelling. It's like, so it's literally tell our stories, build our communities and leave a legacy, because we believe we are not just individuals. If we want to uplift our people, we have to uplift all of our communities and all of our families. And so for me, we see that part of our role in the country is to use our cultural values and spiritual values to help weave our communities together, but also to reframe how we look at sexuality and gender, especially in an environment that says, or people try to say that feminism is equated to transphobia, which is outrageous. And so coming out, I think I was about 11 when I first realized I was attracted to girls. And by the time I was 16, I found the word lesbian. I hadn't been familiar with it until that point. I was born with a bit of attitude. I think I was brought up as the eldest, and so when I thought I was, it's like, cool, I don't tell everybody. There was no dissonance. There was no issues. I found out that people might have had issues, but I was brought up staunch. And so I came with an expectation that people can handle, and they just like move out of the way, people. And so because I have that strong confidence, because of the way I was brought up, because of the support, huge support I got from my family and my circles, then as I flowed into my community work and activism, I've always wanted to take on a role that says for those who have no voice, for those who are too scared to speak, then that I will take that on as fully eldest child thing going on. I was probably at that stage a lesbian. When I was a bit older, in say my early 20s, I came across the term of whakatapui. So it's a traditional term that means intimate partner of the same sex. So we have adopted this. So this is centuries old, already in our culture. And so that prompted me to start to want to do a bit more research. So my PhD was the first study on whakatapui. And I was only the second person to find evidence of our existence pre-colonial. And so, so when I got that term, it's like, great, here's a word that takes my diverse sexuality and links it inextricably with my culture, with my spirituality, that says actually we are not all just one thing, we are all of these things. And so that's part of how we do our activism, how we run our life, and we advocate because we think all of us should be able to live lives that we can pull all the parts of ourselves together. And so many parts of the world try to force us to separate everything out and be acceptable to them in their little boxes. And we're like, that's not going to happen.
Wow, thank you. John?
Let's see. Well, I've often said that James Baldwin made me gay. This was in the 60s. Cool. This was in the 60s, before Stonewall. My high school English teacher told me, you should read this novel and report on it, Another Country. And it was beyond imagining that there were these characters in the novel in New York City, where I lived, who were living out what I was feeling. And so kind of my first round of coming out was going to all the places where Baldwin had characters to see if I could find any men like that. And so it was a total secret, and that's what I did for, like 3 years. Then in college, I got to a sort of second stage of coming out, where I got to the point where I realized, actually, this is the way I'm going to be for the rest of my life. I mean, this is who I am. And I actually began telling close friends, one at a time. So that felt like a big step forward. And then in the early 70s, after Stonewall and the eruption of gay liberation in New York, I started going to meetings of gay and lesbian organizations, which is the way we referred to it then. And there were other people who were talking about doing research and finding a gay history. And I thought, this is my life, my future. And so I made the decision that I was in school at the time, that's what I was going to do with my life. That was the work I was going to do. And really, for all of my adult life, I have been doing some version of LGBT research, writing, publishing, public speaking, using history as a tool for the community, whether it be in a formal way, like submitting briefs in court cases, or just as a form of community education. So people, and especially back in the 70s and early 80s, so people had a sense of a heritage, that they weren't the first people, the first ones, but there was a story to be told. And that's the work that I've done has been so closely attached to my identity. And even though officially I'm retired, I'm continuing to do history and probably always will.
Very nice. Thank you, John. Channyn.
Well, hi, y'all. Well, if James Baldwin made you gay, Shantae Moore made me transgender. So, it's interesting because I remember that album cover, A Love Supreme. And I remember after fighting so hard to stay in this, I guess what we would consider now to be a gender neutral space, that album cover with her with the pin curls and the waves just did it for me. And I just remember I always had a very supportive mother. And a good friend of mine now, who was then my hairdresser, used to always say, no, Channyn got her hair done in high school, you know? So here I was, somebody who, for all points and purposes, presented as male and who responded as male, but openly was in high school with very typical female hairstyles, typical makeup, what one would consider to be female identified. And it was really interesting. My coming out was what I consider to be unfortunately uneventful. And the reason why I say unfortunately uneventful is because everyone's coming out should be uneventful. No one's coming out should be fraught with distinction or anger or rejection or things like that. And while my parents were not necessarily pleased, they did recognize that it was my path and it was my life, and that their mandate as my parents were to support me.
Nice.
You know, in reference to the work that I do. So I come from years of advocacy, about 20 years worth. I have always likened myself to champion for those who were marginalized and disenfranchised from many realms, whether that looked like HIV, experiencing homelessness, more specifically LGBTQ causes and rights. Right now, I do work that is considered to be very corporate. But I tell you something, what I enjoy about this role that I'm in right now is that representation matters. And that for so many trans women who dream of going into social service work, there are not a lot of examples of what does it look like for a trans woman who actually is not a service provider. So many of us in community only know of trans people who are doing service provision. And while that's so important, I also want to remind trans people that there is so much other work out here where your talent is needed. Other than service provision. So when I get to walk into boardrooms, when I get to sit in front of donors, when I get to sit in front of individual givers, I am sitting, my identity is always with me, but it's not at the forefront, you know? And it gives context for other trans people after me to say, wow, I can be something else. You know, I truly can. I can go on forever. So I'm just going to pass the proverbial mic. And you know, I'm sure that you'll have more questions for me that I'll be gladly to answer.
Thank you.
So I'm 56 years old, and I came out probably, I would say, late 1970s. my parents were very hippie, liberal journalists, or maybe more libertarian, I would say, in retrospect. But they would have been hypocrites not to accept me, since gay people and even a really butch lesbian named Joel lived with them off and on, and many other. It was like a commune. So when I was in high school at Lane Tech High School, a friend of mine, Kim, she was coming out to me, and in doing so, she gave me this book called Loving Someone Gay. She was in many ways coming out to me, but also making it easier for me to come out, because she kind of knew I was, and I sort of did too. I went away to college at 17 and kind of was immediately out. Like I don't even remember a door opening. I was just out. I started the women's soccer team at Drake University. I was speaking on panels like freshman year. I don't even know what happened. But at the same time, I had always also knew I wanted to be a journalist. I knew I wanted to be a journalist before I knew I was a lesbian. Both my mother and my stepfather were journalists in Chicago, and I was starting to do a family newsletter at 10 and writing for the Chicago Defender at 10. So it was nothing more that I wanted to be than a journalist.
Oh, wow.
And when I came out as a lesbian, that was a conflict in 1980.
How so?
How so? Because as I started to take journalism classes, being out on campus, my professors started to say, not so fast. Out of a paternalism, which it can be, is mean-spirited, but people don't, they think they're being gentle and kind to tell you, well, you won't have a career that way, young lady. So I started a women's newsletter at Drake, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna be a typesetter the rest of my life, and I'm gonna make my own papers, pre-internet era. And I was pretty devastated by it. I seriously attempted suicide in my sophomore year. And a professor there who ultimately, he was closeted and married at the time, but ultimately became a world-renowned gay poet. He came out to me in my poetry class on a paper I wrote. After I had tried to commit suicide, he wrote on my thing saying it'll get better. It gets better. Believe it or not, he said it gets better in 1982. And I knew right then what he meant. He was closeted, he was gay, he was risking his whole career telling me it would get better. And I was like, okay, nobody's gonna tell me the rest of my life what I can and can't be. And if I can't be a journalist, I'll do it on the side. Luckily, a month after I graduated in 1984, I moved back to Chicago. My mom heard about a job at a gay newspaper, which I didn't even know existed. And I haven't looked back since. And I feel extremely fortunate that I came into journalism, probably you as much as you, John, into history, at the moment where it was percolating and important and vital. And we were like on the front lines of that history that the historians then document, and that every day, and I still feel it today, but I certainly felt it in the 1980s as a 21-year-old covering protests and I mean, protests with 12 people, okay? They changed the world.
Yeah.
We have 12,000 now, we're disappointed. But 12 people would show up to an ACT UP protest sometimes, unless it was like a national. Daryl in the audience can tell you that. Mona can tell you that. We were excited when a few dozen people, 100 people at the CTA. But covering that, right? Being part of it and covering it was just an amazing place to be. Both the sadness of covering people my age who were dying, but also documenting their lives because nobody else was. Tribune certainly wasn't. Tribune had their own reporters dying of AIDS, and my dad would tell me, and he said they won't write about it. They'll write an obit, but they won't write about what happened. So I was in the right place at the right time because of the generations before me that made that possible, and feel lucky every day to still be doing it.
Wow.
And by the way, my mother did not have an easy time with me coming out, but I call it the Cher syndrome. When Chastity, before Chastity was Chastity came out to Cher, and Cher had trouble with it.
Yeah.
And it's like, excuse me, everybody in your life is queer, and you're gonna judge me. So I was like that with my mother. And she tried to have a gay guy named Jay. When I was a teenager, she had him ask me if I was gay. And I said to him, if my mother wants to know if I'm gay, she can ask me herself. So I brought a girlfriend home, and that was all that was. And then it was cool after that.
Thank you all for sharing that. I didn't come out until I was in my 30s. I was married with children when the light bulb went on over my head. But I just remember having that anxiety at first that apparently none of you felt. But And I was a grown-ass person. But then, stepping over the threshold of the closet, right, and not looking back, certainly. And fortunately for me, my husband, ex-husband, and I are very good friends and raised our children as co-parents and all of that. But coming out does tend to be a process where you are coming out over and over and over again. And then we celebrate National Coming Out Day as though it's like one event. But how does that show up in your lives, if at all, that constant, like, oh, by the way, I'm lesbian. I mean, and we're all very public, right? But still.
Well, I'll just say, I don't think I hide it very well, but people see what they want to see.
That's so true.
It is unbelievable how much I have to come out. Google, okay? Just Google. But it's really funny. A year ago this week, I took over at the Reader. Mm-hmm. And I was actually really self-conscious about being as openly gay as I am and dealing with these two straight as straight can be owners. I've been self-conscious for the last year a little bit. And it's really funny. And the board is all straight, as far as I know. And we've had a lot of queer coverage in there, but the Reader always had queer coverage. Yeah. So I don't feel like I need to apologize for it, but I have this
Although you
gut
had
check.
lesbians on the cover that first week.
Yeah. I kept saying to the board and to the owners, I'm not in charge of the editorial. You can put me in charge of the editorial. I promise you. Of course, and I hired a bunch of queer people too, but it's weird. I'm like, at 56 years old, I'm having to think about, am I being too gay? Because I want to be fair. I've always worked in a queer environment. I don't want to overwhelm with that. And I know we're not, but it is something I think about all the time. But I am constantly coming out. I am in an environment where I talk at a corporation like everybody here does. You're out, right? They don't know who you are, and it's the first thing they know about you. And it's a weird thing about being queer that we even have to do that. Now, other people, I would say that might be similar in a genderqueer environment or, pronouns that people are now having to constantly remind people, check those things. And maybe if you have a disability that isn't obvious, you have to, you're constantly telling people. I always say our movement is the most similar to that movement because we're about as different as everybody can be, right? Yeah. Everyone's panel is very different, but we come together when we need to come together for big things. But we also have to come out. We have to constantly come out. And it is a different burden that other people don't understand. And what that can chip away at your self-esteem and all that other kind of stuff. So even though I feel lucky and I've been in the perfect place in the perfect city in the world to do this, I still check myself sometimes.
Yeah, I so agree with Tracy. As a trans person, coming out is such a unique experience. I'm an openly transgender person, particularly when it comes to advocacy and work. However, in my personal, private life, again, I am extremely uneventful. I am simply...
That's true for most of us,
I am, but I am simply the neighbor who avoids coming out in the hallway when my neighbor's kids are out there. I'm just like, oh my God. I'm like, it's the kids. I'm like, let me just wait so they do not bombard me with a bunch of like kid stuff. But here's the thing. I said a minute ago that representation is important. And it's so true. Representation is important. But there is also a such thing as representation burden. There is also a such thing as representation fatigue. And again, as I navigate society, being transgender is not something that immediately jumps out at you. But I'm often situated in spaces where it's, Channyn, you're transgender, here you go. And it's just like, no, like, there are lots of transgender people in this city, in these organizations that are well situated to do this work of advocacy and speaking about community needs than myself. And it also does a disservice to all of the voices and experiences of community when we task one person to constantly tell these stories over and over again. Also too, when I think about coming out as a trans person, coming out has so many layers, you know? It's like on one hand, as a trans person, we historically want to come out to go back into a closet. It's very interesting, right? We want to come out and let folks know I'm going to be transitioning so that way I can actually blend away and disappear. It's such an interesting dichotomy to that, you know? So you live in this space of, well, I want to be authentic to myself, but I mean, I want to live a hetero cis-normative life. So do I really want my in-laws knowing this? Do I want them to see me as a trans person? Because when I was a kid, I wanted to be a girl. I didn't want to be transgender. And I think that those are the things that we miss in community, is that we shove banners and we shove things into trans people's hands and we expect them to wave them. And when they don't, we're so resentful, but we forget that when we were children, speaking for myself, again, I knew I was a girl. I knew nothing about being transgender. This work essentially found me. And I wanted to be visible for others who felt like me. But a part of that visibility was to give other people the platform and the voice, so that way they can speak and tell their stories as well. And then hopefully they can create space for individuals to be able to tell their stories also. The last thing I'll kind of say to that is, my mother is a very matter-of-fact woman. If you've ever met her, she's just very, straight to the point. And I kind of talk, and I transitioned young. I was a teenager.
Wow.
I was a teenager. I transitioned very young. I always tell people, I'm like, I don't know what it's like to navigate society as a man. I don't know. I never had that experience. I do not know those anxieties. I don't know those fears. I don't know. But I asked my mother, I said, why didn't you let me transition like jazz when I was like 11, 10, all these other things? And I mean, I got a transition at 16. So anyway, my mother simply says to me, she goes, well, honey, I named you because you didn't have the voice to name yourself. But now that you have your own voice, it's for you to tell the world what your name is. Wow. Simple as that.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Simple as that.
Wow.
Just simple logic. Like, well, were you going to tell me that this is who you were? No, I had to steward for you. I had to identify you because you didn't have the voice to. But now that you have the voice to, well, then you tell folks who you are. And you build a life for yourself. And that has been my motto. Giving people the space and the platform to tell the world what their name is and who they are, so they can continue to do this work and continue to move forward, so they can support others in doing this work also.
Wow. That's gospel from the Church of Channyn.
Well, so thinking about this, I feel like, and maybe it's because of the age that I've now reached, and the amount of change that's occurred in the course of my adulthood, which has been like 50 years now, I feel like I've lived more than one life. Like there was, in the 70s, in a certain sense, living in New York in a gay activist world, I felt like I was actually in a very protected environment. And I had tremendous support all around me because this queer world was so large, to do the kind of work that I wanted to do, and was protected in certain ways from the homophobia. Except then I had to earn a living. And how was I going to earn a living? And so all the jobs that I would get, which were fine, they were activist jobs not in queer-related issues, were very accepting of me, but it took me away from, it meant that I didn't have the space to do the research and writing that I wanted to do. And I finally thought, John, you have no desire to do this, but you're going to have to look for an academic job. Well, to look for an academic job as maybe the first or second person in the country to be doing a queer history dissertation, I applied for 60 jobs at least, and got one interview. And I got that one interview because my partner at the time knew someone in that history department, and so I got hired. But I got hired in Greensboro, North Carolina, of all places. So I moved from this protected environment of New York to teaching in Greensboro, where people, one of the newspapers when I arrived wrote an article about my hire in which they referred to me as the fag doctor from New York. Okay. So, so the word was out that
Literally.
yes. And I would teach these U.S. history courses, not queer history courses, but I would include, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I could feel the discomfort of students in the classroom. And finally, one day in class, a student raised her hand. So, I said, okay. And she said, "Are you a homosexual?" And I was completely taken aback by the question. And I said, "Yes, I am." And then went on with the rest of the class. But after that, I noticed that the class was so much more relaxed. It's like this thing that they were talking about among themselves because, the fag doctor was hired and stuff, like suddenly. And so I then developed a teaching policy where I had students introduce themselves at length. I would ask them all these personal questions about themselves, and then they could ask me questions about myself when I introduced myself. And I would always weave into it that I was gay somehow or another, and it just created a kind of safety. And then by contrast, and I'll just sort of end with this, then when I get hired at UIC in 1999, they're actually looking for someone who does LGBT studies. Oh my God, what's going on here? And, there's this positive article in the Sun-Times about this author of so many books and stuff like that. And of course, it turned out to be, and I don't want to say it's not like there isn't stuff going on. We all know that there's a lot going on that needs attending to. But by the turn of this century, there were safe spaces in a way for me being out and for students being out in a way that was not true 40 years ago. And it was amazing to sort of have the privilege of kind of lasting that long and in a way knowing that at least in certain ways I had helped make that happen. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Lovely. Well, it turns out that when you're lesbian femme, you spend the entire of your life coming out because nobody assumes. Us going, come on. And unless I'm with my invariably butch partner, then they go, oh, okay. And then they ask me who's the man, and so all those things. That's been most of my life. Now, and of course, my partner, now my wife, when we're out, she's constantly misgendered. And so I have to make decisions all the time. Usually it's the decision to not say something. It's never the decision to speak. It's always, do I have to do it this time? And every time to say, because by misgendering her, then they are saying, assuming that I'm straight, and I am offended by that. And so, but when I think about though back home and the whole thing of coming out, because I come from a culture where traditionally we didn't have LGBTIQ identities as such. We've found a lot of evidence from the European records of the people who came over and our own traditional narratives that said that sex positivity was core part of our project, because our belief was if you're going to do it, you should be good at it. And I still believe in that. But also that it's an accepted part of who you were, your sexuality, who you loved, how your gender was fluid. And we certainly had roles based on our skills, our talents, and our superpowers, but that part wasn't so much an issue. And so we didn't have names for that. We didn't have special roles. or anything like that. And sometimes we want to create that specialness from the past so we can bring it back now. But now it's, I suppose I think we have to, we want to be out, we want to be visible because it's a way of finding each other. Absolutely. It's a way of connecting. We have a thing in my culture called emodi. It's our life spark. It's that thing inside us that all our uniqueness and passions, all the things we care about. And so we want to see that reflected in the world. We want to see whether that's from the past or right around us. And so many of our people are not seeing that, even inside our rainbow communities, let alone the rest of the world. And so there's that aspect. But of course, in doing that, and I think it's reflected around the world as well, we have a youth, even though most of us knew when we were young what our gender is, we knew when we were young what our sexuality was, my generations, we waited till we were older. Most of us, till we came out, till we transitioned. We have this global phenomena of our young people coming out and transitioning while they're young, and they are bearing the brunt for that courage. And at home, outrageous levels of suicide, self-harm, depression amongst our young people, bullying in schools is rife, violence against trans, non-binary and intersex people. And so there's a cost then to be out, and you're always assessing your safety. And I suppose for me as an elder in our communities then is that it is my responsibility to help create the safety. And so whether that's working in government, whereas 2 weeks ago I was speaking at the United Nations in Geneva, whether that's sitting down with someone's parents and reminding them that their number one job is to look after their child, then we do what needs to be done. And so I think I would love to go to be in the days, if we think about 50 years from now, what things might look at, and we're reflecting back to Stonewall and into the future, is I would love to see that much more like how our ancestors were much more fluid, much more relaxed about it, didn't need to worry. You use the right names and pronouns because that is a normal part of life. You love who you like, you live the life that is right for you, regardless of the sex you were assigned at birth. You just get on with it. I loved what you said. It's like, just want to live our lives. It's a low bar. It's a low bar. Seriously.
And you mentioned, how dangerous it can be to be out. And even today, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I co-host OUTspoken, and it's not unusual to hear stories about the things that people have faced when they come out, even in this day and age in the United States. And I'm wondering, and you gave us some examples, what we can do, especially given all of us on the stage are activists and many of the people in the audience are activists. How do we make coming out not such a big deal? Like Tracy said, not even knowing where the door is, it's just not even a doorway, you just are. How do we do that?
I think the curriculum bill that passed and was signed by Governor Pritzker this year is monumental, and of course needs to be in every state, where LGBT people and issues and history is taught within the age appropriate ranks. I think that's going to be transformative. We all had to search out our own history in the library and hidden racks and stuff like that, right? And obviously Google and other things, wonderful. There are so many ways people can find things, but it's uncurated and a lot of damaging stuff on there as well. Amazon sells horrible stuff against gay people, right? So that, to me, that's transformative, but now we have to make sure that that's happening. That's not just happening at Chicago Public Schools, but wherever people are from in Illinois or wherever, that those school districts are also doing it. Because my worry is they're just gonna, my nephew went to Chicago Public Schools and he had like 2 sentences on the civil rights movement. Right? We don't teach our social justice history at all. So I don't want to leave it to chance or to a law. Just because there's gay marriage doesn't mean we're going to keep it, right? Like we have to keep sustaining it and doing the work and making sure it happens.
Yeah, I agree with Tracy, and I am so proud to actually have recently been appointed to the Transgender Task Force for that curriculum bill. With Governor Pritzker, so I'm really excited about that. But yes, I believe that in order for that world to happen, in order to see that lofty ideal come into existence, we have to normalize our identities first, you know, until people begin to stop seeing LGBTQ identities from the lens of sex. We're always going to say things like, oh, well, I don't want you pushing that agenda on my kids. I was pushing an agenda on your kids. It's just that we're being represented on TV, finally. You know, we're asking to be represented in books. Again, we're talking about people who spurned the civil rights movement forward, who had to leave town in the back of our civil rights leaders' trunks, you know? So this is what we're talking about. We need those things to be front and forward. Again, it's easy to savage a people whose humanity that you do not see at the forefront. We're already up to 18 murders of trans women already, you know, and the reason being is because you do not see their humanity is not what's being presented at the forefront. You mentioned something about 30 or 50 years into the future, and I just look forward to a day when this conversation is just incredibly boring. I look forward to the day when this conversation is just met with just palm to chin, you know? I mean, honestly, because it is terribly redundant to have to constantly defend your humanity, to have to always, have to litigate your humanity, I should even say further, that I have to constantly litigate my womanhood, you know, my personhood. You know, those are things that a person should not have to deal with. I mean, I've got enough to contend with. I'm trying to make it to work on time and pay taxes and, you know, meet demands and come home and cook and juggle the world in one hand. And the last thing that I should have to worry about is, am I going to navigate the world home safe? Am I going to make it home safely? I shouldn't have to worry about those things, you know? I really shouldn't. And that's what pushes me to continue to do the work that I do. I'm tired, and I'm relatively young. I like to think I am.
You are young.
This panel, you're definitely
Youngest person on this panel.
But I'm tired.
Yeah.
You know, I'm speaking as a really tired woman. And again, it's so important for us to hold up our future leaders. And you know, the other piece I'll just add to that is, I love community. And when I say I love community, I mean that from an all-encompassing term. Trans women are being killed, but Black boys are being gunned down in the streets. My best friend's sister was murdered, and they know who killed her, and they yet have went to arrest the person who killed her. You know, Black women are being killed left and right. You know, again, I want to be someone who is embedded in community as an interrupter of violence. I do not care about my identity being brought forward. I want to be someone who is invested in community, who is saying enough is enough, and what can I do to end this? That's what I want to do, you know?
Yeah, it's you know, it's 50 years from now. Well, one thing is, what will the identities be? You know, it's you know, once upon a time, if you go back, here's the historian speaking now. Once upon a time, the identities that we describe as gay and lesbian in sort of U.S. society and Western European societies were described as being what we today call transgender. And then at a certain point, what today we describe as transgender got incorporated into what today we describe as gay and lesbian. And then eventually, you know, and so it's like over the generations, the identities in a culture can really change. And so what will we be coming out, well, it won't be me, but what will people be coming out as in another 50 years? It's really hard to know that.
It is.
I mean, it's astounding. And of course, it gets meshed into the other identities and identities of oppression in the culture, like race and gender and class and things like that. And as long as all of those hierarchies exist, really lousy things are going to be happening to people. So,
Certainly true.
So in my country, a lot of our organisations are run by young people. And so we don't do anything for our young people without them. And so we trust them to live their own lives. And so a lot of the time, all the support groups that happen in schools and communities across the country are all run by young people. And so again, I feel like for those of us who are older, those who've been around a long time, we're secure in our life. I'm not under threat of getting beaten up anymore. That it's what support can we give for them, because they create their own spaces and they create their own safety, and we try and kind of come around them and say, so they can decide what they want to do. And so whether it's, I guess, coming out, sometimes even if it's a constant thing, whether you do it every now and then, but it's still only a tiny bit of your life. It's like all the different parts of yourself and everything that you're committed to. Again, I suppose I want to reiterate, if I could tell one quick story. When I came out, I hitchhiked for nearly 2 days to go and see my great-grandmother, who was born in 1903. And I tried to explain to her, it was very difficult, what a lesbian was. And when she finally got it, she goes, oh, I had aunties like that. So long after we'd had a colonization had been in our country, we'd had a treaty, we'd had most of our land and language has been taken off us, but the suppression of sexuality and gender also was occurring. My great aunties lived as a couple in a house together. And so when anybody tries to tell me this is not real, this is not part of our culture, it's like, oh, you're trampling on the memory of my great grandmother right now. You're in dangerous territory. But this is, and so when I said to her, oh, what names did you call them? And she goes, they weren't names. They were just part of the family. So all my research, and our Māori word for family is whānau, part of the whānau.
Nice.
It's like, that's who we are. And one of our elders said he went to his grandmother and said, what name did you have a name for them back in the day? And she goes, of course. And he says, what was it? And she said, mokopuna, means grandchild.
My goodness. Isn't it something?
yeah.
Isn't it something how there seems to be such a movement afoot to erase and dismantle queer identities from communities of color? You know, and I notice that so much, and it's just so disheartening, and I just feel like we have got to fight tooth and nail to make sure that that does not happen.
That's right. That's right. And on that note, let's thank our panelists for this amazing conversation. And now you get to be part of the conversation too. So I am going to do an Oprah thing, and I'm going to come out into the audience. And if folks have questions or they want to tell their own coming out story, you are welcome to do that. So
I love questions.
We love questions, yes. So does anybody have anything? Don't be shy. And I know most of you, and I know you both.
Now no one wants to talk.
Mona.
Oh, here we go. Stand up, please.
I'm wondering if some folks on the panels could talk about maybe interesting laws or policies or places, kind of like you were mentioning, where there is maybe a more progressive path forward, where we could steal some good ideas.
That's a great question.
California is really the standard bearer on a lot of legislation. I think especially on their how they treat their child welfare system.
Yes.
Our child welfare system is a huge feeder into homeless youth, and most of those are LGBTQ. Some studies show as high as 80% of youth in care who are LGBTQ end up homeless at some point in their young lives. And we know that it's from other families as well. So I think now it's about transforming systems that are kind of next to the education system, and certainly reforming or dismantling juvenile justice system, which has a higher rate of incarceration of LGBTQ youth of color, and obviously feeds into the adult prison system. What I've been really heartened with, and this started a little bit before Trump got in, it used to be that I would cover things and there'd be a gay speaker and a trans speaker and a black person. I mean, like everybody was representing their own identities. Right kind of after Michael Brown and Ferguson, what started to happen, because the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 3 queer women, African-American women, it like pivoted a lot of talk in social justice circles generationally. First of all, generationally, it became the younger generation taking over in a huge way. And they did it in such a queer, inclusive way that, first of all, it took away the mistaken notion that there's more homophobia in communities of color. It's never been the case. It's always been the interpretation, but it's never been the case. The white power structure of Chicago kept gay rights out, not the black politicians and the Latino politicians both supported gay rights in Chicago. So I feel like there's this, our movement, our LGBTQ movement now, I feel like the gauntlet's down, because I have seen a rise of racist and transphobic, all sorts of things happening within the LGBT community that has not risen to the challenge of intersectionality in a way they should. I unfriend people a lot these days, mostly white gay men, cisgender white gay men, who are so poorly participating in sophisticated dialogues about intersexuality. Like, they are just horrible. They're acting like Trumpites.
Yes.
And so I think, for those of us in leadership positions, we need to call these people. I don't like to call it culture name, but we absolutely, and certainly as a white person, I need to challenge that person after I defriend them. To say, no, this is ridiculous. Like, and so that's what's the shame here. I mean, I think we have a lot we can do to make our own house, our LGBTQ house, better, because there is so much amazing stuff going on, whether that's immigration, justice work, or whatever, that is queer inclusive now in Chicago and all around the country. And it's this amazing opportunity where we can lift all boats. We need to do a better job, I think, as a community.
I love that, lift all boats. Yes.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts, stories?
So no one has a question out there, huh?
Do we have a question for the audience?
I have a comment.
Hold on. Stand up, please.
So I wish I would ask all of you to comment on, I work in the civil rights, and we all work in the civil rights, but I feel less that the legal sometimes field is offering as many remedies as perhaps the policy offers remedies now. And so I'm wondering if you could each comment on what you think about the direction moving forward in 40 years, where, to his question, where are some models of how we're going to achieve social change? Will it be more in the policy area? Will it be, especially given that the courts, we all went, that perhaps the courts may not be the future for where our civil rights may lay. I don't know. I'd be interested in what any of you think about that.
I think that's a good point, because we know that the current federal administration has appointed a lot of judges that we don't know anything about, and that affects, and not just the Supreme Court, but that's going to affect what happens in the courts for the next generation.
And it will be and that will be the feeder into the Supreme Court.
That's the feeder into the Supreme Court. Yes.
So
Yes.
we can project that the courts may or may not be the location of where we will secure civil rights that we have to date achieved, and so therefore, are we looking more into the policy? And so, to the point that if the judges that are currently are appointed, we know that a majority of them are anti-LGBT right now. Many of them are lifelong appointments, and that those lower courts will be feeders into the higher courts, to the Supreme Court. And so are we projecting then that the courts may not be what they had been in the past in terms of securing civil rights. And so where's our future lie in terms of securing those civil rights?
You know, Mona, I am not the most versed when it comes to policy, but from what I'm seeing right now, I'm afraid that the future, as I'm seeing it today, is going to be highly contingent upon what state you live in. When it comes to LGBTQ rights. You're going to have some states where it is just absolutely god awful to be a queer person. And you're going to have some states like Illinois where you have this protected little island. I'm seeing this country being torn into its own little factions or what have you, if you will. And that's what shouldn't be happening. In an ideal state, we would be able to rely on government to lay the groundwork, to level the playing field, right? Because again, to just believe that people themselves are going to willingly embrace change and are going to just, you know, provide equity for all, it's just not going to happen. You know, we saw that in the 1860s, we saw it in the 1960s, and we see it today. You know, government does have to step in at some point. But when the government is against you, well, that's not so much as a good idea. So, you know, we're just going to have to really be reliant on grassroots efforts. We're going to have to be really reliant upon education and teaching and just supporting our young people through whatever positive means that we can offer. Because honestly, I feel like that's the only way that we can go. And it's just so frightening to have to lean on people's benevolence. But that's what we kind of are moving to right now. I don't want to have to lean on anybody's mercy and benevolence and hope for would-be education. But that's where we're going. You know,
I'd like to follow up on that, because it's a dangerous way to be. It's like you've got to mate somewhere so it'll be all right until they go. It has to be systemic. The issues we face are from historical oppression, but we need some systematic and systemic ways of addressing those. So I want to advocate for approaching these. So there's the laws in our country. We're a very small country, 4.5 million people, but our politicians, even our Prime Minister, are very accessible. We have a Rainbow Caucus in Parliament, and we have a Rainbow Room in the Parliament buildings. So we have different parts of legislation. We can very easily go in and advocate. Right now, we're up to the second reading for a bill that will allow trans, non-binary and intersex people to self-identify their gender, and it will change all of their identity documents. We have world-leading passport where anybody can self-identify. So there's things, but there's other things where there's a 30-year waiting list for gender-affirming surgery. So sometimes it's legislation that we absolutely need because it's that top level, then that sends a signal down to the whole of society and to government that says, right, these all things now need to change to respond to this. But then other things where that is a blunt way of doing things and it loses the nuance. So for example, the intersex roundtable, through a year, it took a year to be able to meet with the head of the Ministry of Health. But once we arranged that meeting and the advocacy that had been going on for quite some time before that, we've created a clinical network that is one of the first of its type in the world. We're writing the guidelines for the treatment of intersex babies and infants in our country. And that could not be done at the law level. This could only be done at this level, working directly with the midwives, with the doctors, with the families. And so, but it's constant. We have to, part of my work is leading a national rainbow strategy that looks at all the different issues that we're facing in our different ages, our different communities, and our different identities across a whole lot of different sectors, and saying what are our priorities in that sector. Because sometimes our government's also famous for, if they get some funding, then they choose what to do with it instead of asking what we would like to do with it.
That sounds familiar.
So, they're like, oh, we're going to do this. I'm like, not anywhere did we tell you we wanted to do that, but okay. So we want to be able to provide much more interactive dialogue with them at whatever level. And that means we can then use all of our superpowers. Those of us who are good at research, those of us who are good at speaking, those of us who are good at the sitting in the meetings for hours and hours and negotiating with government officials. We all have our place. Need all of us.
It's interesting because so many first of all, our entire LGBT movement benefited from the civil rights movement and Roe v. Wade and all these other movements before us. And many of those victories were like Loving v. Virginia and the anti-miscegenation laws, and then Roe v. Wade on the right to privacy. And these were court victories, and our movement accelerated probably 2 to 3 times the speed of other movements, 100 times the speed of the African American movement, because of those prior victories. So we have to be ready for those setbacks that will come, like Plessy v. Ferguson, that took decades to undo, and know that our fight is going back to the streets. And it's in the homes, which we have infiltrated. We have infiltrated many levels of government, including corporate CEO suites.
That's right.
And have changed and transformed society way beyond what it was 50 years ago. So even if the courts set it back, we have forced it forward beyond them. Usually the courts often will lead. I mean, they don't lead, they come along at the same time, but now they might try to pull us back. And they may in a legal sense, but I am relatively optimistic that they won't be able to succeed for long. And also that the social successes will outweigh it. But I 100% agree. I was just thinking of that, what Channyn said. People will be moving to safe states. And of course, the other states are going to be poor because the gay people left. And the talent pool left, and the tourism left, and the corporations will leave, like they threaten to leave when there's anti-gay laws. So we're going to be subsidizing their hate, and we need to fight that because we need to stop taking our dollars from California and giving it to a state that doesn't want us there anyway.
That's right.
Wow. And on that call to action, thank you for that amazing discussion from the audience, from the panel. I want to thank Tracy, Channyn, John, and Elizabeth for being on the panel. So let's give them another round of applause.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim.
And thank you, Archie, for sharing that amazing story. You are so good on that. And for those at home, thank you for watching today. Before I sign off, I want to leave you with the words of queer poet Andrea Gibson. It is untrue that bravery can be measured by a lack of fear. It takes guts to tremble. It takes tremble to love. So happy coming out day to those who can come out. And for those who can't, we're trembling and fighting for you. Thank you.